Jack Nicholson doesn't owe Hollywood anything. 60 years of showing up, bleeding on screen, dragging performances out of his own soul, and handing them to audiences who had no idea what it cost him. That's not a career. It's a life sentence served with style. And now, at 88, with the parties and the cameras and the Hollywood hills finally behind him, he's talking. Not in the careful, publicist-filtered way most stars talk when they want to seem candid, while still protecting everyone they know. Honestly. The kind of honesty that looks back at 6 of the biggest names in film history and says, plainly, working with you was hell. 6 actors who, by his account, were toxic, indulgent, manipulative, or simply so maddening that he walked away swearing, in most cases, never to repeat the experience. These aren't minor footnotes, these are legends. And what Nicholson has to say about each of them reveals as much about the price of genius as it does about the people themselves, cutting right to the heart of what method acting demands, and what happens when that demand goes unmet. Born in Neptune City, New Jersey, Nicholson arrived in Hollywood in the 1950s, with nothing but nerve and a philosophy he would carry for the rest of his career. His training under acting coach Sanford Meisner gave him one commandment worth following. Acting is living truthfully under imaginary circumstances. That wasn't a technique for Jack. It became the religion he judged everyone else by, the standard against which no shortcut, no ego trip, and no lazy genius could ever measure up. His breakout in Easy Rider in 1969 turned him into a symbol of the counterculture movement, a man who despised phoniness and built a career entirely on refusing to fake anything. Directors like Milos Forman and Stanley Kubrick later spoke of his commitment in almost reverent terms. On One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, he refused to speak to the director for weeks to stay properly inside Randall McMurphy's rebellious mind. And for The Shining, he wrote pages of his own mad ramblings just to inhabit Jack Torrance before the cameras ever rolled. The code was simple and absolute. Show up prepared, tell the truth, bring something dangerous to every take, and never waste a single second with a performance cooked up in front of a bathroom mirror. When that code was broken, Jack Nicholson remembered, every single time. The first name on this list is also the most painful, because this wasn't an enemy, it was a fallen god. Marlon Brando reinvented screen acting with A Streetcar Named Desire and On the Waterfront, creating an entirely new language of performance that made every serious actor of Nicholson's generation reconsider what was even possible. When the two were cast together in the 1976 Western The Missouri Breaks, directed by Arthur Penn, Nicholson arrived on set like a man about to receive the gift he'd waited a lifetime for, a chance to trade scenes with the man who had shaped his entire understanding of the craft. What he found instead was a ghost, a shadow version of the idol he'd worshipped, consumed by a strange and frustrating apathy. Brando never once knew his lines across the entire production, relying on cue cards taped to lamps, to props, and reportedly to co-stars' foreheads. He arrived overweight, adopted a bizarre, lilting Irish accent that nobody had requested, and began appearing in scenes wearing bonnets and dresses, choices that left his director baffled and the rest of the cast struggling to keep their composure. Nicholson's assessment was unsparing. The man who invented modern screen acting had decided it was simpler to read off a prop banana than to actually do the work. That wasn't eccentric artistry. That was a private performance designed to amuse himself, a party where the rest of the production wasn't invited and wasn't welcome. There's a fine line between genius and indulgence, and Brando danced on it every day, usually with his back to the camera so he could read his next line. The Missouri Breaks flopped, and Nicholson walked away carrying a lesson that landed hard. Never meet your heroes, especially the ones who've already stopped trying to be heroic. Shelley Duvall holds a more complicated and ultimately more sympathetic place on this list, because the tension between them during The Shining in 1980 wasn't personal dislike. It was shared damage inflicted by the same director. Stanley Kubrick's methods were brutal for everyone involved in that production, and the shoot stretched over a full year, grinding both actors down in different directions. Nicholson, disciplined and trained, channeled his mounting frustration directly into Jack Torrance's escalating volcanic rage, turning every grinding, miserable day into raw material for the performance. Duvall's gift was something fundamentally different, a raw, transparent vulnerability that Kubrick exploited without mercy, breaking her down take after relentless take until her distress was no longer acting, but genuine psychological fracture. What Nicholson described as exhausting wasn't Duvall herself, but the impossible unpredictability her fractured state created. The difficulty of finding a consistent dance partner when the emotional ground shifted every single morning. A performance needs rhythm, some agreed foundation, even within improvisation, and Kubrick's methods had destroyed that foundation entirely before the shoot was even half done. Nicholson put it plainly at the time. It felt like she brought the storm to set with her every morning, and there was no consistency, no anchor. Years later, though, his perspective shifted completely. What Kubrick put her through was unconscionable, he admitted. No one should have had to endure that. The Shining is a masterpiece, he acknowledged, but one built entirely on the wreckage of two people's sanity, and he has never once pretended otherwise. Tom Cruise represents a clash of philosophies rather than personalities, and their collision happened on the set of A Few Good Men in 1992, one of the most celebrated courtroom dramas that Hollywood has ever produced. Nicholson's Colonel Nathan Jessup and Cruise's Lieutenant Daniel Kaffee delivered one of cinema's most charged and electric confrontations. And "You Can't Handle the Truth" passed immediately and permanently into the culture. Behind that electricity, Nicholson was quietly, thoroughly unimpressed. Cruise arrived at work with every beat of every scene pre-calculated, every gesture rehearsed, every line reading locked in before the cameras ever turned. Where Nicholson thrived on spontaneity and the real danger of not knowing what his scene partner might do next, what he found across from him was machinery. The precise, flawless execution of a result that had been decided long before the first rehearsal. Looking into Cruise's eyes, Nicholson reportedly told a close confidant afterward, "Felt like watching the gears turn behind a perfect smile, impressive and empty simultaneously." The famous courtroom scene amounted, by his account, to throwing everything he had at a wall and receiving back only what had already been perfected in a mirror somewhere. He respected the work ethic completely and without reservation. The soul he couldn't locate. He walked away saying the philosophies were too far apart for the experience to ever be worth repeating, that the difference between them was the difference between a live concert and a studio recording, and he'd always preferred the sweat and the feedback. Faye Dunaway carries the most visible and personal wound on this list, because what happened between them on The Two Jakes wasn't a philosophical disagreement, it was open warfare, and it destroyed something that had once been genuinely extraordinary. Their first collaboration, Chinatown in 1974, produced chemistry so charged and performances so precisely calibrated that the film became one of American cinema's permanent landmarks, the kind of crime drama that gets studied and discussed and argued about across generations. Bringing Dunaway back for the sequel, with Nicholson now directing as well as starring, seemed like the obvious and logical choice. The reality was hostility from the first morning of production. Hours late arrivals, arguments over every single line, and a daily battle over control that made genuine filmmaking nearly impossible. Nicholson put it plainly, directing is an act of trust, the actor trusting the director to protect them, and the director trusting the actor to arrive ready to work. And that trust collapsed before it ever had the chance to form. Scenes were eventually rewritten specifically to minimize the time they spent on screen together, which says everything about how badly things had deteriorated, and Nicholson reportedly came close to firing her outright before the production finally wrapped. The Two Jakes landed as a commercial and critical disappointment, a shadow of everything Chinatown had been, and the professional relationship between two people who had once created something remarkable ended there completely and permanently. Sean Penn enters this list not as a difficult co-star, but as a director whose methods Nicholson found genuinely suffocating, and their 2001 collaboration on The Pledge is where that incompatibility played out in full. Penn's vision for the film, a dark, haunting character study built around psychological realism, matched Nicholson's sensibilities entirely on paper. The problem was execution. Penn mapped out every pause, every glance, every line reading before shooting began, and expected precise replication from his actors, approaching performance as a painting in which every single brushstroke had a predetermined, non-negotiable location. For an actor whose power comes from instinct and the dangerous, living energy of the unplanned moment, this was creative suffocation in its most complete form. Nicholson's description was direct and unambiguous. Penn wanted a puppet, not a performance. And what Nicholson needed was room to move, room to breathe, room to discover something neither of them had planned. He delivered a critically praised performance, regardless of the friction, which reflects the extraordinary depth of his professionalism, but the two have never worked together again. Two genuinely brilliant men, two fundamentally incompatible methods, and no common ground between them. Leonardo DiCaprio is the final name, and the film was Martin Scorsese's The Departed in 2006. a crime epic that gave Nicholson one of his most terrifying and fully inhabited late-career performances as mob boss Frank Costello. The scenes between them carry a menace that feels genuinely live and dangerous, and part of that danger was entirely real. Midway through filming a tense sequence, Nicholson produced a real gun without warning, without rehearsal, and without telling anyone what he was about to do. DiCaprio's shock was immediate and unguarded, the kind of reaction that can't be rehearsed, because the person experiencing it doesn't know it's coming. Scorsese kept the cameras running and captured the raw reaction intact, and it ended up in the finished film. That moment crystallized the essential difference between them. DiCaprio constructs performances with extraordinary discipline and intellectual rigor, arriving fully prepared with his character's psychology mapped from every possible angle, building something brick by perfect brick until the finished work stands as a flawless piece of craft. What that construction method cannot produce, by its very nature, is genuine danger. The live, unscripted possibility that something completely unplanned might happen and become the truest thing in the scene. Nicholson wanted a house that might fall down at any second. What he got across from him was architecture. He credited Scorsese for knowing exactly how to use them both, and acknowledged DiCaprio's gifts without the slightest hesitation, then added that he walked away from the production, certain he wouldn't put himself through it again. The craft was flawless. The risk was absent. What this list adds up to, across 6 names and 6 decades of working at the absolute peak of American entertainment, isn't bitterness, and it isn't the score settling of an old man with unresolved grievances. It's a clear-eyed accounting of what separates acting from performance, truth from technique, and showing up from genuinely arriving with something real. Brando taught him what lazy genius looks like once it stops fighting. Duvall showed him what a director's cruelty does to the instrument he needs most. Cruise and DiCaprio, for all their undeniable achievements in film, represented the polished, controlled kind of movie-making that left him cold. Craft executed to perfection, but stripped of risk, completed without life. Dunaway showed him what ego does to trust. Penn showed him what absolute control does to discovery. Every one of these people taught him something, he put it plainly, even when the lesson was only what not to do, or who not to be. Acting isn't pretending. Any child can manage that. It's showing up with a piece of your soul, genuinely ready to bleed if the work demands it. And if you can't bring that, he doesn't want you standing next to him. At 88, with nothing left to protect and no reputation left to manage carefully, Jack Nicholson remains exactly what he's always been, the most honest voice in a town built entirely on illusion.